So in the military, having those eyes and ears out front, that forward presence is absolutely crucial.
Right, absolutely. Can't underestimate that.
And that's what we're getting into today with Clausewitz, looking at Book 5, Chapter 7 of On War.
Okay.
Advanced Guard and Outposts.
Right. Yeah.
Which is right up your alley.
It is, yeah, definitely. And what's so interesting is how relevant this 19th century text is, even today, right? I mean, we can talk about drones and satellites and all this kind of stuff, but at the end of the day, the importance of securing an army on the move or even in a defensive posture, it all comes down to these forward units.
He doesn't just tell you what to do, though, does he? He really digs into the why.
Yeah.
And it's not like a one-size-fits-all solution. He uses some great comparisons to kind of get that across, right?
Yeah, and that's one of the things I find most fascinating. He uses examples of Frederick the Great and Napoleon, right? Two incredibly prominent military thinkers and leaders, and how they approach this. And they have very different approaches.
Right.
Frederick the Great, much more minimalist in his approach to forward units, especially considering how aggressive he was tactically.
You'd think you'd want a huge screen out front, right?
Right, exactly. And that's because part of it is he trusted the discipline of his troops so much.
The Prussians.
The Prussians. He could camp closer to the enemy because he knew that if something happened, his guys could react so quickly. So he didn't need as big of a buffer, essentially.
Right. That makes sense. But then you have Napoleon just a few decades later who's all about that strong, heavy advanced guard.
Right.
Why the change?
Well, I think you have to think about how warfare was evolving at the time, right? You know, warfare, especially under Napoleon, was becoming much more about maneuver.
Right.
It was less about brute force and more about outsmarting your opponent, right? Think about, like, a chess match versus a fencing duel.
Right.
You know, Napoleon needed time and information to set those pieces in motion, and that larger advanced guard acted as both a shield and a very, very important intelligence gathering force.
And I bet the scale of his army had something to do with that too, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Commanding those massive grand army legions.
It's a completely different animal.
It's a whole different thing than Frederick maneuvering his, smaller, more nimble forces.
Right. You're exactly right. I mean, when you're talking about trying to coordinate the movements of sometimes 100,000 men or more, making sure that they have the supplies they need, and perhaps most importantly, keeping them out of harm's way, requires a very significant forward screen to give you that intelligence and that time to allow that massive force to maneuver effectively.
Wow.
It's about maintaining coherence of the force, which is very, very difficult to do when you have that many men and that much equipment moving around.
Yeah, and Clausewitz, he points out that it's not just about protecting your own forces. This strong central advance guard can be used offensively.
Oh, absolutely.
Especially when you're in pursuit or even during a strategic retreat.
That's right. And he emphasizes that the central mass of the army is so critical.
Right.
And often that's spearheaded by that central advance guard.
Right.
And a strong presence there not only safeguards the center itself, but it also indirectly shields your flanks.
Okay.
So it creates this ripple effect of security, if you will. It's like a mobile fortress that's constantly probing for weaknesses in the enemy lines while protecting its own. It can be key in a retreat, too. You know, it's not just a purely defensive thing.
Right.
A strong advanced guard allows you to dictate the pace of that retreat, buy yourself some time to reposition.
So it's like they're controlling the tempo even when they're the ones pulling back.
Exactly. It's controlled. It's not chaotic. And I think that plays into this larger point he makes about adaptability.
Right.
You know, he really emphasizes this throughout the chapter, that there's no one-size-fits-all approach to these forward units.
Okay.
Whether it's advanced guards or outposts, which we can talk about in a bit. It's about analyzing the terrain, the enemy, your own strengths and weaknesses, and then choosing the right tool for the job.
Speaking of outposts, how do they fit into this whole picture? They seem like kind of the less glamorous cousins of the advanced guard.
Well, yeah, they're more static, right?
Okay.
But you can think of it this way. When the army is on the move, it's the advanced guard doing that scouting, that engaging. But when you halt, even for a short period, outposts become absolutely essential.
Right.
They create that protective screen, that breathing room around the main force.
So it gives the main body a chance to prepare or rest or just think straight after a long march.
Exactly. And, you know, Clausewitz even suggests that the longer you stay in one place, the more those outposts start to resemble a more continuous defensive line.
Hmm.
Almost like, miniature fortifications in a way.
Makes sense. Yeah, you're transitioning from a very mobile, fluid situation to something that's more static, more about holding ground.
Exactly.
And he uses the Anglo-Dutch army
Yeah.
back in 1794, 1795 as an example of this, right?
He does, yeah. They were facing the French, and they had this very, very effective system of these reinforced outposts.
Yeah.
Each one was like its own little fortress, and it really, really slowed down that French advance. And it just goes to show that even in a defensive posture,
Right.
these forward positions, if they're well planned and well supported, can be incredibly disruptive.
But then you had the flip side of that with Murat at Tertino, right, in 1812.
Oh, yes, Murat.
Where he fails to properly secure his position with a strong outpost line, and the Russians make him pay for it.
Big time. Yeah, that's a perfect example of what happens when you underestimate importance of those seemingly minor details.
Right.
Murat, who is Napoleon's cavalry commander, brilliant cavalry commander, but in this case didn't prioritize a well-organized outpost line, and he lost valuable artillery pieces and men because of it.
It goes to show those decisions about outposts, where they are, how strong they are,
right,
huge consequences.
Yeah, you snooze, you lose, right? Especially in war. And it's interesting.
Yeah.
This all ties back to something we were talking about earlier, the organization of the army.
Okay.
Clausewitz. He argues that whether an army is structured around corps or divisions can actually impact how those forward units, those advanced guards and outposts are used.
So a more divisional structure with its smaller, self-contained units might lend itself to like more decentralized, flexible, advanced guards and outposts.
Right.
While a core-based army, being bigger, maybe a little less nimble,
right, harder to move around,
might favor a more centralized approach.
Yeah, and again, it comes back to there's no one size fits all, right?
Right.
The best way to structure and deploy those forward units, it all depends on the specific situation, the enemy you're facing, the terrain, the weather, everything.
It really highlights the need for commanders who can think on their feet,
Absolutely.
who can look at a situation, often with limited information, and make those judgment calls.
And that's what Clausewitz is really getting at, right? He doesn't want to give you a list of rules.
Right.
He wants you to understand the why behind those tactical decisions so you can adapt.
Be adaptable.
On the fly. That's the mark of a good commander.
Absolutely. And I think that's a vital lesson really for anyone in the military.
Oh, 100%. At any level, whether you're commanding a platoon or a division, these principles apply.
And, we've been talking a lot about the defensive side of advanced guards and outposts.
Right.
But it's important to remember, they can be very offensive tools, too.
Absolutely, yeah.
Think about a pursuit, for example.
Oh, absolutely.
That's where a really strong, aggressive, advanced guard
keeps the pressure on.
Can be decisive.
Right. And can turn a retreat into a rout.
Yeah, stop them from regrouping, digging in again.
Keep them off balance, exactly.
They're vital in a retreat, too.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Think about a rear guard. It's kind of like an advanced guard in reverse.
Right, protecting your withdrawal.
Exactly. Buying you time and space.
Controlling that tempo, that's the key.
It all comes back to that.
Whether you're advancing or withdrawing, it's about controlling the pace of the battle.
And that's really what Clausewitz wants us to remember, right?
Yeah.
Warfare is about intelligence. It's about adapting.
Making the right decisions at the right time, exactly.
And those forward units, the advanced guards, the outposts.
They're your eyes and ears.
They're the tip of the spear.
Right on the cutting edge.
Not just pawns to be thrown away.
No, absolutely not. He makes that very clear. They're crucial elements.
He wants us to think about these principles, not as rules set in stone.
Yeah, more like guidelines, a framework.
A framework for how to think about warfare. And that's a good place to wrap up, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
Whether you're commanding troops in the field or planning a campaign, that ability to analyze, to adapt, that's what separates,
the good from the great. Yeah, the ones who make it and the ones who, well...
Let's just say their names aren't remembered by history.
Exactly. History remembers the adaptable.
And on that note, we've come to the end of our deep dive into advanced guard and outposts with Clausewitz.
It's been a pleasure, as always.
Always a pleasure to chat with you. Until next time, keep those strategic minds engaged.